The rain did not stop. It ran down the glass of the small kitchen window in long gray streaks, blurring the dark outline of the pine trees that covered the hills of Misty Ridge. Maeve Evans stood with her hands pressed against the cold wooden sill, watching the water pool on the gravel path outside. She was 22 years old, and for the past 3 years, she had watched her world shrink until it was nothing more than this 4-room cottage and the steady sound of her father's labored breathing from the next room. The fire in the hearth was dangerously low, containing only 2 small logs that hissed as the dampness crept through the gaps in the floorboards, chilling her ankles. Behind her, the bedroom door creaked open slightly, and she heard the familiar rustle of the wool blankets. Her father, Arthur Evans, had been a proud man, a meticulous record-keeper for the local logging companies, but a sudden winter fever had taken his strength, and then his employment. The medical bills had followed quickly, piling up on the kitchen table like dry leaves, until the family name meant nothing in the valley except a collection of unpaid balances. Maeve turned from the window as a heavy car pulled up to the gate, its black paint glistening under the dim evening sky, its engine idling with a low, threatening rumble. Mr. Henderson stepped out of the vehicle holding a thick leather folder under his arm, while his leather boots gasped through the mud of the walkway. He did not knock softly. He struck the wooden door 3 times with the heavy brass handle of his walking stick, a sound that made Maeve's chest tighten. When she pulled the door open, the cold wind rushed past her, carrying the smell of wet earth and the sharp scent of Henderson's expensive cologne. He stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation, setting his muddy case directly on her clean kitchen table, and opening the silver clasps with a slow, deliberate click. He named the final number without looking at her, his fingers tracing the lines of figures on the official court notice. The sum was larger than anything Maeve had imagined, a mountain of interest and late fees stacked on top of the original money they had borrowed for her father's treatments. Henderson gave her exactly 7 days to produce the full amount in cash, or the local authorities would seize the cottage, the furniture, and the remaining boxes of her mother's old books. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low whisper, as he suggested a private arrangement that would settle the balance without the court's involvement. But Maeve met his gaze directly and told him to leave her house before she called the sheriff. After the black car drove away into the gathering dark, Maeve walked into her father's bedroom and sat on the edge of the mattress, taking his thin hand in both of hers. Arthur looked up at her with hollow eyes, his voice cracking as he apologized for leaving her with nothing but debts and a leaking roof. Maeve squeezed his fingers gently, reminding him that he had taught her how to read, how to balance accounts, and how to look at the world with a straight spine, which was a better inheritance than any piece of land. She stayed with him until his eyes closed in a fitful sleep, her mind spinning as she tried to calculate a way to find thousands of dollars in less than a week. A second knock sounded at the front door just after 8 o'clock, but it was different from the aggressive strikes of the debt collector. It was 2 quiet, measured raps, almost polite, against the heavy thrum of the rain on the roof. Maeve walked back into the kitchen, her hand resting on the iron poker beside the hearth, as she pulled the heavy bolt back and opened the door a few inches. A man stood on the porch, his tall frame blocking the wind, wearing a long dark coat that was soaked through at the shoulders. He raised his head slightly, and the dim light of her single oil lamp caught his features, freezing the breath in her throat. He was strikingly pale, his skin possessing the smooth clarity of white stone, and a thick lock of snow-white hair fell across his forehead from beneath the brim of his wet hat. His eyes were a deep, clear gray, catching the lamplight in a way that seemed almost metallic, his expression entirely calm as he looked down at her. He introduced himself simply as Damien, stating that he had a business proposition that would solve her current difficulties if she was willing to listen. Maeve hesitated, her instincts warning her against trusting a stranger who appeared in the middle of a storm. But the emptiness of her purse and the ticking of the clock pushed her to step aside and let him enter. Damien did not look around her small home with pity or curiosity. He kept his eyes fixed on her face as he reached inside his coat and placed a certified bank draft on the table. Maeve looked down and saw the exact figure Henderson had demanded written out, down to the very last penny in a clean, elegant script. Damien explained his terms clearly. He required a wife who could manage a large household, a woman who did not panic when facing intimidation, and he had observed her refusal to break under Henderson's threats. In exchange for her signature on a marriage certificate at the Valley Chapel at dawn, the money would belong to her father, and she would leave Misty Ridge with him by noon. Maeve looked from the paper to the man with the white hair, her mind working through the reality of the choice before her. She asked if her father would receive a proper nurse and regular visits from the city doctor, and Damien nodded once, promising that a medical carriage would arrive at the cottage before the sun was fully up. She felt a cold shiver pass over her skin as she realized she was agreeing to bind her life to a man she did not know, an individual who carried fortunes in his pockets and moved through the night like a shadow. She looked him in the eyes and accepted the bargain, agreeing to meet him at the altar when the clock struck 6. The Valley Chapel was freezing when Maeve arrived, her small canvas bag balanced on her forearm as the first pale light of dawn broke through the eastern pines. The building was empty, except for an elderly minister who looked sleepy and confused, and a quiet driver who stood near the doors as a witness to the brief ceremony. Damien was already waiting near the altar, dressed in a plain black suit that emphasized the lean, powerful build of his frame and the stark contrast of his white hair. They did not exchange rings, and there were no flowers or music, only the low murmur of the minister reading the traditional words from an old leather book. When Maeve signed her name on the marriage register, her fingers were steady, despite the chill in the air, her eyes catching the full name her new husband had written above hers. Damien Frost was the name on the white paper, written in that same precise script she had seen on the bank draft the night before. As they walked out into the misty morning, the driver took her bag and placed it in the back of a long, dark vehicle that sat waiting on the gravel path. Maeve turned to look back at the village one last time, seeing the chimneys of Misty Ridge beginning to smoke, as the town woke up completely unaware of the choice she had just made. The ride into the mountains was silent, the vehicle moving smoothly along the winding roads that led away from the valley floor and into the dense timberlands. Maeve sat across from Damien, observing him without making it obvious, noting the complete stillness of his posture as he watched the trees pass by the window. His skin looked even lighter in the morning frost, a flawless pale complexion that showed no lines of fatigue or age despite the early hour. She realized he had not blinked in several minutes, his gray eyes fixed on the landscape with a deep, focused intensity that made the small car feel incredibly narrow. She asked him how far they were traveling, and Damien turned his head toward her, his voice low and resonant, as he replied that his home lay beyond the high ridge where the valley people rarely ventured. He explained that the estate had belonged to his family for more than 2 centuries, a private sanctuary that required a strong hand to maintain its order against outside interference. Maeve mentioned the financial records she had seen in her father's desk, noting that certain names on the debt notices matched the companies that operated near the mountain borders. Damien's jaw tightened slightly at her words, a brief flash of something dark and dangerous crossing his features before he regained his composure. The vehicle passed through a set of massive iron gates that stood between 2 stone pillars, the metalwork shaped into the likeness of twin wolves guarding a crescent moon. An elderly gateman in a dark coat stepped out of a small stone lodge, lifting his lantern to look inside the car before bowing deeply to the man sitting opposite Maeve. The road became smoother, lined with tall cedar trees that created a dark canopy overhead, blocking out most of the morning sun and leaving the ground covered in deep shadows. At the end of the long drive, Pinecrest Hall rose against the mountainside, a massive structure of black stone and gray slate that looked older than the forest itself. A dozen servants were lined up on the wide stone steps, their dark uniforms perfectly pressed, as the vehicle came to a complete stop at the base of the terrace. Damien opened the door himself, stepping out onto the gravel and turning to offer his pale hand to Maeve as she descended from the car. The head butler, a silver-haired man with a formal posture, stepped forward and bowed until his forehead nearly touched his chest, his voice clear in the morning air. "Welcome home, Your Majesty." The old man said his words, causing Maeve to freeze on the gravel as she looked from the butler to her husband. Damien did not deny the title. He simply nodded to the butler and kept his arm offered to Maeve, his gray eyes watching her reaction with a quiet, guarded intensity. She looked up at the towering stone facade of Pinecrest Hall, its high windows reflecting the gray sky like mirrors, and realized the bargain she had struck was much larger than a farmer's estate. The man she had married at dawn was not a wealthy eccentric or a private landowner. He was a king, ruling a hidden world from a castle in the mountains. Maeve took a slow breath, straightened her shoulders and placed her hand back in his, determined not to let the servants see her tremble. He led her through the massive oak doors into an entrance hall that was larger than the town square of Misty Ridge, its floors made of polished black marble that reflected the light of a dozen iron chandeliers. The walls were lined with old paintings of men and women who shared Damien's striking features, their pale skin and light hair staring down from the gilded frames with cold elegance. Damien turned to her, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space, as he told her that the house was now hers to manage and protect. Maeve looked at him, her voice level, as she stated that they had a great deal to discuss regarding the truth of his identity. The private rooms assigned to Maeve were located in the south wing of the hall, featuring high ceilings, heavy velvet drapes, and a large stone fireplace that was already crackling with a bright fire. Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, arrived shortly after noon with a tray of hot tea and fresh bread. Her manners perfectly polite, but her eyes curious as she assisted Maeve with her small bag. The older woman explained the layout of the household, noting that the master preferred the house to remain quiet during the daylight hours, as his work kept him occupied primarily after the sun went down. Maeve thanked her, noting the unusual silence of the servants, who moved through the corridors with steps that made no sound at all. By late afternoon, a messenger arrived from the valley bringing a short note from her father's new nurse, confirming that the city doctor had already arrived at the cottage. Arthur Evans was resting comfortably, his room warmed by a new supply of dry oak wood, and his first round of proper medication had already been administered. Maeve held the white paper against her chest, letting out a long breath of relief, as she realized the first part of her bargain had been fulfilled completely. She refolded the letter and placed it inside her mother's old Bible, which she set on the small writing desk near the window. Damien joined her in the library, just as the sun was dipping below the mountain peaks, the red light of the sunset casting long shadows across the rows of leather-bound books. He had removed his formal coat, wearing a simple white shirt that made his pale skin appear almost translucent in the twilight, his long fingers resting on the edge of a massive mahogany desk. He sat across from her and began to explain the reality of his position, stating that his family had ruled the Northern Valley for generations, acting as protectors of a lineage that lived apart from the human towns. He was the king of his people, but his right to the title was currently being challenged by those who wished to exploit the land. His uncle Raymond Frost and his cousin Charles had spent the past year assembling a case before the traditional council, claiming that Damien's isolation made him unfit to hold the leadership of the estate. They had been systematically draining the financial resources of the outer properties, using men like Mr. Henderson to manufacture debts and force the human tenants off the land to build commercial mills. Damien explained that a ruler without a queen was viewed as temporary by the old laws, and his relatives were using his unmarried status as a weapon to force a council of management over Pinecrest Hall. He had needed a wife whose character was beyond reproach, someone who could not be bought or intimidated by Raymond's wealth. Maeve listened to his explanation, her mind organizing the details into a clear structure, just as her father had taught her to analyze business disputes. She asked why he had chosen a poor girl from the valley instead of a wealthy lady from the city families who understood the politics of high society. Damien met her gaze, his gray eyes dark in the shadows of the library, as he stated that a city lady would have married his title, whereas Maeve had married him to save her father's life. He needed someone who understood the value of a contract, someone who would look at the ledgers with an honest eye, rather than a desire for luxury. She stood up and walked to the shelves, pulling down the current ledger for the mountain timber leases that sat near the desk, its cover thick with dust. She opened the pages and pointed to a series of entries from the past 6 months, noting that the amounts recorded for the lumber sales did not match the volume of trucks she had seen leaving the valley. Someone was underreporting the profits, leaving a massive gap in the estate's income that made the property appear less valuable than it actually was. Damien rose from his chair and stood beside her, his breath cold against her cheek, as he looked down at the figures she had highlighted. They spent the next 3 hours working side by side at the table, crossing out false entries and comparing the estate books with the private notes her father had kept before his dismissal. Maeve found herself adapting quickly to Damien's presence, his absolute focus and quiet movements matching her own methodical style of work. She noticed that he did not touch the tea or the biscuits Mrs. Gable had left on the side table, his attention entirely fixed on the rows of numbers that filled the white pages. There was a strange, magnetic intensity to his stillness, a sense of immense power contained behind a mask of perfect discipline that made her skin tingle whenever their hands brushed against the paper. As the clock in the hall struck 11, Maeve closed the ledger and rubbed the back of her neck, feeling the fatigue of the long day catching up to her muscles. Damien reached out and took the heavy book from her hands, his fingers remarkably cold, but his grip steady and reassuring as he set the volume aside. He told her that she had done enough for one evening, advising her to rest before the arrival of his relatives, who had requested a formal dinner the following night to meet the new mistress of the hall. Maeve looked at him, her voice quiet, as she promised to be ready for whatever games his family intended to play. The dining room of Pinecrest Hall was lit by 40 candles when the guests arrived the next evening, the silver and crystal on the long table gleaming against the dark wood. Uncle Raymond was a heavy-set man with white hair that lacked the silver brilliance of Damien's, his face flushed from wine and his eyes sharp with an immediate dislike for Maeve. Beside him sat Cousin Charles, a younger man with a narrow smile and expensive city clothing that seemed out of place in the mountain manor, his manners overly polite and his words laced with subtle insults. They were accompanied by Lady Beatrice, a wealthy widow from a neighboring valley, who had spent the past year hoping to become the next Duchess of the region. Lady Beatrice looked across the table at Maeve, her eyes tracing the simple green silk dress Mrs. Gable had helped her alter from the estate's wardrobe, her smile tight and regular. She remarked that it must be an extraordinary change for a girl from Misty Ridge to find herself sitting in a room of such historical importance, suggesting that the management of a household this large might prove too complicated for someone without formal training. Maeve lifted her glass, her voice calm and clear, as she replied that accounting followed the same rules whether one was counting logs in a valley yard or balancing the revenues of a grand estate. She looked directly at Raymond, noting that she had spent the afternoon reviewing the October accounts for the Northern Timber Tracts, specifically the leases held by his private company. She mentioned that she had found a discrepancy of $4,000 between the volume of lumber processed and the payments received by the main treasury, a mistake that she was sure his clerks had simply overlooked during the busy harvest season. The table went entirely silent for several seconds, the only sound being the crackle of the fire behind Raymond's chair as the older man's face turned a deeper shade of red. Charles attempted to laugh the comment off, suggesting that a young woman might not understand the complexities of commercial shipping fees and mountain transport costs. Damien spoke then, his voice low and freezing like the winter wind outside, stating that his wife had complete authority over the estate records and that her calculations were rarely incorrect. He looked at his cousin with a steady, unblinking gaze that caused the younger man to drop his eyes to his plate, his fingers tightening around his silver fork until his knuckles went white. Maeve felt the strength of Damien's support beside her, a heavy protective presence that filled the room and pushed back against the hostility of his relatives. After the guests had departed for the evening, Maeve walked out onto the stone terrace to clear her head, the cold mountain air refreshing against her skin after the heat of the dining room. The moon was full, casting a silver light across the snow-capped peaks and illuminating the dark forest that surrounded the hall like a wall of spears. She heard a soft movement behind her and turned to see Damien standing near the door, his white hair gleaming in the moonlight, his pale skin making him look like a statue carved from ice. He walked to the railing and looked out over the valley, his hands clasped behind his back, in that characteristic posture of absolute control. He told her that she had handled his uncle with remarkable skill, noting that Raymond had not been challenged so directly in his own dining room for more than 10 years. Maeve leaned against the stone balustrade, her voice quiet as she stated that she hated bullies, whether they wore muddy boots like Henderson or expensive suits like his cousin Charles. She looked at Damien, asking him gently about the true nature of his people, noting that she had seen the way the servants moved and the complete absence of food or drink on his side of the table during the dinner. Damien was silent for a long moment, the wind catching the edges of his dark coat as he turned his gray eyes toward her. He explained that his lineage was ancient, a people who drew their strength from the night and whose lives were measured in centuries rather than decades, a reality that the valley towns translated into legends of monsters. He was indeed a vampire, the ruler of this territory responsible for maintaining the boundary between his world and the human towns, while keeping his own rebellious kin from breaking the peace. He had lived alone in Pinecrest Hall since his father's passing, surrounded by enemies who wanted his power and humans who feared his name, until he had knocked on her door in the middle of the storm. Maeve did not step back from him. She looked at his pale hands resting on the stone railing, remembering the warmth of the money that had saved her father, and the steady weight of his presence when his family had tried to make her feel small. She stated that a monster would have let her father die to force her into compliance, whereas Damien had paid the price up front and treated her as an equal partner from the moment they met. A faint line appeared at the corner of Damien's mouth, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him, his voice dropping to a whisper as he thanked her for her trust. The following Tuesday brought a heavy snow that covered the mountain paths in a thick layer of white, trapping the inhabitants of Pinecrest Hall inside the stone walls. Maeve used the isolation to deepen her investigation, moving from the library to the old estate office in the basement, where the historical records were kept in large iron boxes. She discovered a series of old property deeds that showed Raymond had been systematically transferring the water rights of the valley streams to his own name, an action that would give him total control over the local logging mills within 3 years. If he succeeded, he could starve the independent human workers out of the valley, completely forcing them to sell their land for pennies. She was sorting through a stack of old receipts when Damien entered the room carrying an oil lamp that cast a warm glow over the dusty shelves of papers. He sat on the bench beside her, his long fingers carefully lifting a map of the valley borders that her father had drawn 10 years ago during his time as a clerk. He pointed to a small cabin located near the western ridge, explaining that it had been his father's private retreat, a place where the old king had spent his final days writing down the true history of their lineage. The cabin contained the original council journals, documents that could prove Raymond's financial manipulation went back more than a generation, completely destroying his credibility before the elders. Maeve suggested they go find the journals before the snow blocked the upper trails, completely stating that they could not afford to wait for Raymond to make the first move at the upcoming council hearing. Damien hesitated, expressing concern for her safety in the mountain cold, But Maeve reminded him that she had grown up in these hills and knew how to handle a winter trail as well as any guide. Within an hour, they were in a small horse-drawn sleigh, the animals' bells jingling softly as they moved through the white forest toward the high ridge. The air was sharp and clean, the pine branches bending under the weight of the fresh snow as they climbed higher into the mountains. They reached the cabin just as a sudden squall blew in from the north, the wind howling through the trees and reducing their visibility to less than 10 yards. Damien lifted Maeve from the sleigh, his powerful arms carrying her easily through the deep drifts and into the shelter of the wooden structure, while the horse was secured in the small shed behind the house. The interior of the cabin was simple, containing only a wooden bed, a stone hearth, and a single table where an old iron chest sat beneath a layer of frost. Maeve worked quickly to build a fire with the dry wood stored near the door, her hands shaking slightly from the intense cold that had settled into her bones. Damien stood near the window, his white hair contrasting sharply with the dark wood of the logs, his gray eyes watching the storm outside, with that unblinking intensity she was growing familiar with. He moved away from the glass and sat near the hearth, his pale skin catching the red light of the flames as the fire began to take hold, throwing a deep warmth into the small room. He looked at Maeve, his voice low as he admitted that he had forgotten what it felt like to sit in a warm room with someone who did not want his crown or fear his touch. He had spent his entire life preparing to be a king, learning to hide his thoughts and steel his heart against any vulnerability until he had become as cold as the stone walls of his castle. Maeve reached out and placed her hand over his pale fingers, ignoring the chill of his skin as she told him that a king who felt nothing was a tyrant, whereas a king who carried the weight of his people's suffering was a true leader. She looked into his gray eyes, seeing the deep exhaustion he had carried alone for 14 months, the quiet pain of a son who had lost his father and been forced into a war he did not want. Damien did not pull his hand away. His fingers closed around hers with a slow, deliberate pressure that felt like the anchor she had been searching for since her family's ruin. They stayed by the fire for hours, talking about their childhoods, her memories of her mother's garden in the valley, and his memories of learning the ancient laws from his father beneath the summer stars. Maeve found the iron chest beneath the table, its lock rusted through, containing the leather-bound journals of the old king, written in a clear, flowing hand that detailed every cent Raymond had stolen from the estate. With the evidence secure in her bag, they sat together in the quiet cabin as the storm outside began to die, down the silence between them filled with a new understanding that had nothing to do with their original contract. When they returned to Pinecrest Hall the next morning, the household felt different to Maeve, the grand spaces no longer seeming cold or imposing, but familiar and protective. She walked up the stone steps, with her head held high, the heavy bag of journals balanced on her arm, knowing that they finally held the weapons needed to finish the fight Raymond had started. Damien walked beside her, his white hair catching the morning sun, his posture as regal as ever, but his eyes softer whenever he looked down at the woman who had stood by his side in the mountain storm. The day of the formal council hearing arrived on the last Thursday of November, the great hall of Pinecrest Hall filled with the elders of the lineage and the prominent leaders of the valley towns. The 3 senior judges sat behind a long stone table at the far end of the room, their faces ancient and unreadable beneath their dark robes, their hands resting on the traditional staffs of office. Raymond and Charles stood on the left side of the room, surrounded by their lawyers and a stack of financial folders they had prepared to prove Damien's incompetence. Lady Beatrice sat in the front row of the gallery, her face composed, but her eyes flashing with a triumphant light as the proceedings began. Raymond opened his argument with a long speech about the decline of the estate's revenues, pointing to the empty ledger entries and the complaints of the human tenants who had been forced off their lands. He claimed that Damien's isolation and his sudden marriage to a poor human girl from the valley were proof of an unstable mind, an impulsive decision made by a young ruler who was drowning in the responsibilities of his title. He demanded that the council strip Damien of his active authority and appoint a management committee consisting of himself, his son Charles, and Mr. Henderson to oversee the territory's future. Maeve stood up from the respondents' table before Damien could rise, her dark green dress rustling in the quiet room, as she stepped forward to face the three judges directly. She stated that she had spent the past 4 weeks reviewing every ledger in the estate office, and she wished to present the original journals of the late king, which had been recovered from the mountain cabin. She opened her folder and began to read the dates and figures, matching Raymond's private company records with the missing payments from the main treasury, exposing a systematic theft that had begun 7 years before the old king's death. She showed how Raymond had used Mr. Henderson to manufacture false debts against honest human families, like the Cartwrights using the estate's name to execute illegal evictions while pocketing the lease transfer fees for himself. She presented the domestic accounts that Mrs. Gable had kept secretly, proving that Charles had been skimming money intended for the household staff's wages to pay for his own luxury apartments in the city. Her voice remained level and clear, her arguments structured with the perfect precision of a trained accountant, leaving no room for Raymond's lawyers to interrupt or deny the evidence. Mrs. Gable stepped forward from the side of the hall, setting a second box of documents on the judge's table, confirming that she had witnessed Charles signing the Duke's name on several false transport orders. 2 of the independent human loggers from the valley stood up in the back rows, testifying that they had been threatened with violence by Henderson's men if they did not sell their timber rights to Raymond's agents. The atmosphere in the great hall shifted instantly, the smooth confidence of the conspirators evaporating as the judges began to review the original signatures in the late king's journals. Raymond's face turned from red to a pale ash gray as he realized his entire network of deceit had been laid bare in less than 30 minutes by the very woman he had dismissed as a penniless cottage girl. He turned to the judges, his voice shaking with a sudden rage as he claimed the documents were forgeries produced by a human who wanted to steal his family's inheritance. The senior judge struck his staff against the stone floor, a sound like a thunderclap that silenced the room completely, his ancient eyes fixing on Raymond with cold disapproval as he declared the evidence to be authentic and undeniable. The council delivered its verdict before the sun had reached its peak, stripping Raymond and Charles of all titles, properties, and authority within the Northern Valley, ordering their immediate exile from the territory. Mr. Henderson was remanded to the local authorities to face criminal charges for fraud and extortion, his legal files seized by the court for a full investigation into his business practices. The application for a management council was rejected permanently, the judges confirming Damien's absolute right to the crown and recognizing Maeve as the legitimate mistress of Pinecrest Hall. As the hall cleared, Damien walked over to Maeve, his white hair catching the light from the high windows, his gray eyes shining with a deep emotional warmth that he no longer tried to hide behind his mask of kingly discipline. He took both of her hands in his pale fingers, his voice low and rich, as he told the remaining elders that he had married a woman to secure his position, but he had found a partner who had saved his entire kingdom from ruin. Maeve looked up at him, her heart full as she realized their bargain was finished, replaced by something real that had been forged in the dark of the library and the cold of the mountain storm. 3 months later, the south lawns of Pinecrest Hall were open to the public. For the first winter harvest celebration held in the Manor's living memory, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and music. Long tables had been set out across the snow-cleared gravel paths, piled high with fresh bread, roasted meats, and warm cider for the families who worked the mountain lands. Children from the valley towns ran through the formal gardens, their boots crunching on the frost, while the older tenants sat on the stone benches, talking with the relaxed ease of people who no longer feared the arrival of a debt collector. Arthur Evans sat near the hearth in the small garden pavilion, a thick wool blanket across his knees, and a cup of hot tea held steadily in his hands, his color completely restored after 3 months of proper medical care. He watched his daughter walk across the terrace, his eyes bright with a quiet pride as he saw the respect the household staff and the valley people showed her as she passed. Maeve stopped beside his chair, leaning down to press a kiss against his cheek and ensure he was warm enough before she returned to her husband's side at the top of the stone steps. Damien stood near the massive oak doors, wearing a simple dark coat that set off the brilliant white of his hair and the porcelain clarity of his skin, his hand resting on the stone railing as he watched the celebration below. He did not look like an isolated monster or a cold ruler anymore. He looked like a man who had finally found his home, his eyes soft as they followed Maeve's movements across the lawn. When she reached the steps, he offered his arm with that timeless courtesy that had once frightened her, but now felt like the safest place in the world. Maeve slipped her hand through his arm, looking out over the mountains as the winter sun began to dip behind the western ridges, painting the snow in shades of gold and violet. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this terrace from the cold kitchen in Misty Ridge, and the terrifying knock on her door to the grand hall where she had fought for her family's future. She realized that she had not been a victim of desperation or a prize won in a bargain. She had been a woman who made a choice to fight, and in doing so, she had found a love that was deeper than any legend the valley people whispered in the dark. The future lay before her like the white mountain slopes, vast and unmarked, but she no longer feared the cold or the shadows that came with the night. Walking through the quiet corridors of Pinecrest Hall, as the evening candles were lit one by one, Maeve looked toward the coming years with a deep, settling peace in her chest. She knew there would be more ledgers to balance, more challenges to face from the world outside their valley, and old prejudices to heal between her father's people and the ancient lineage her husband ruled from these stone walls. Yet she felt entirely equal to the task, her mind sharp and her purpose clear as she adapted to the rhythm of a life that measured its seasons by the strength of the bonds they had built. She reached into her pocket and felt the empty space where their original contract had once been, remembering the night she had watched the written terms turn to ash in the library fireplace, releasing them both from the language of debt and obligation. They were no longer bound by a desperate girl's need or a lonely king's strategy. They were held together by the quiet choice they made every single morning to look at each other without masks. She saw Damien waiting for her at the end of the long gallery, his white hair catching the silver moonlight through the high glass windows, his hand extended toward her in the quiet dark of their home. She walked toward him with a steady step, knowing that every room in this ancient house now belonged to the story they were writing together with every breath they drew. The world outside Misty Ridge would continue to tell its stories of monsters in the timberlands and desperate choices made in the rain. But the truth lived here, in the warmth of a shared fire, and the strength of a hand that had never let her go. She placed her fingers in his, feeling the cold skin that had become her comfort, and together they turned toward the window to watch the stars appear over the valley they had chosen to protect. Everything she had lost had been restored in a form she could never have imagined. And as the great clock in the hall began to strike the midnight hour, Maeve Evans looked into the gray eyes of her king and knew that the night was finally theirs. She knew that her father would live out his days in peace, that the valley families would plant their crops without fear, and that the crown she wore was not a weight to be carried, but a promise of a future where they would never have to stand alone against the storm again. The quiet of the mountain evening always brought a certain clarity to the mind, a space where the noise of the world faded into the background and left only the essential truths of a person's life. Looking out from the high balcony of the south wing, Maeve watched the distant lights of the valley houses twinkle against the dark blue of the Oregon hills, each small spark representing a home that was safe because of the work they had done. She reflected on how easily a person could confuse a beginning with an ending, how the terrifying collapse of her old life in the valley had felt like the final chapter of her story, rather than the rough opening lines of a much greater journey. It was a gentle realization that came to her not as a grand lesson learned from a book, but as a slow gathering of light after a long winter, an understanding that the moments of greatest uncertainty are often the very doors through which our true strength must walk. She knew that the years ahead would require patience, that the differences between her own brief human span and the centuries her husband would carry were a landscape they would have to navigate with care and tenderness. But as she felt the steady presence of Damien beside her, his breath a cool stir against her hair, she understood that love was not about finding someone who shared your exact history or your exact nature. It was about finding the one individual who looked at your scars and saw your capacity to heal, the one who stood with you in the middle of the wreckage and helped you rebuild the walls stronger than they had ever been before. The future was no longer an enemy to be feared or a debt to be paid. It was a white page waiting for their footsteps, and she was content to walk into it side by side with the king who had given her a place to truly belong. The snow continued to fall softly over the high ridges of Pinecrest Hall, burying the old paths and smoothing the rough edges of the stone terraces until the entire estate looked like a sanctuary carved from the winter sky itself. Maeve turned away from the railing and met Damien's gaze, seeing her own reflection clear in the deep gray of his eyes, a reflection that showed a woman entirely secure in the position she had earned through her own courage and intelligence. They walked back inside together, the heavy glass doors closing out the chill of the mountain wind and sealing them within the quiet warmth of the rooms they had claimed from the shadows of the past. There were no more secrets hidden in the closed wings of the manor, no more false figures waiting to trap them in the pages of the old ledgers, only the plain reality of a household that had been washed clean by the truth. As she lay her head against his chest, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of a life that had endured for centuries and would now be shared with her, Maeve knew that the valley below would always have its legends and its fears. But here, high above the mist, the story was simple, grounded in the daily choices of two people who had looked past the titles and the desperation to find the one thing that could never be broken by the storm. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the fire carry her into sleep, entirely certain of the tomorrow that was waiting for them when the sun rose over the pines. The final hours of the night always passed the quickest, when the mind was at peace, the darkness shifting slowly into the deep violet of the pre-dawn hours before the first light of morning touched the highest peaks of the mountains. Maeve woke to the quiet stillness of the room, the fire having burned down to a bed of glowing red embers that threw soft shadows across the ceiling of the bedroom. She sat up and looked at the window, seeing the frost creating intricate patterns of silver leaves against the glass, a natural art that seemed to mirror the complex beauty of the life she was building here. Damien was sitting in the armchair near the hearth, his white hair loose around his shoulders, his hands resting quietly on the arms of the chair, as he watched her with that patient, protective gaze that had become her constant anchor. He did not speak, knowing that the silence between them was already full of everything they needed to say, a shared understanding that had been tested in the fires of the council hall and found to be pure. Maeve smiled at him, a small private movement of her lips that carried all the gratitude and affection she had held back during the difficult weeks of their investigation, and she reached out her hand across the space between them. Damien rose and crossed the room, his movements as fluid and silent as the mountain shadows, and he took her fingers in his touch no longer feeling cold to her, but simply like the familiar iron that held the foundation of her world together. They stood by the window together as the first golden ray of the sun broke through the eastern clouds, illuminating the valley below, and signaling the beginning of a new day where they would walk as equals under the open sky. The transformation of the Northern Valley did not happen overnight, but the changes were visible in the way the people carried themselves, the lighter step of the loggers, and the open doors of the town shops in Misty Ridge. Maeve spent her mornings working with the new clerks she had hired to oversee the timber accounts, ensuring that every contract was fair and every payment was delivered directly to the families who earned it. Her father had moved into a comfortable cottage on the sunnier side of the estate grounds, where he spent his afternoons teaching the younger children of the staff how to balance figures and read the old maps of the territory. He had found a new purpose in the recovery of his health, his laughter returning to the rooms of Pinecrest Hall during the Sunday dinners they shared around the long kitchen table. Damien spent less time hidden in the shadows of the library, his presence now a welcome sight among the human tenants who had learned to see his pale skin and white hair as the marks of a protector rather than a threat. The old laws of the lineage were being rewritten piece by piece to reflect the partnership that had saved the territory, creating a new framework where the two worlds could live side by side without the need for walls or secrecy. Maeve looked out over the courtyard as the carriage prepared for their afternoon visit to the valley, her heart steady and her mind clear as she picked up her cloak and walked down the steps to meet her husband. She knew that the path they had chosen was unique, a bridge built across centuries of fear and misunderstanding, but she also knew that they had the strength to maintain it for as long as the mountains stood against the sky. She placed her hand in Damien's as he helped her into the vehicle, their fingers locking together with that absolute certainty that had become the defining truth of her life. And as the gates of Pinecrest Hall opened before them, they drove forward into the bright light of a future they had earned together. The path toward tomorrow is never a straight line, but rather a winding trail that requires us to look back at the ground we have covered, even as we reach for the ridge ahead. Standing in the soft light of the late afternoon, Maeve watched the shadows of the pine trees lengthen across the valley floor, her thoughts turning naturally to the quiet wisdom her father had shared with her during their hardest winters in the old cottage. He had told her that the value of a person's life is not measured by the security of their circumstances, but by the clarity of their sight when the fog rolls in and threatens to obscure the true boundaries of right and wrong. It was a thought that stayed with her as she looked at the great stone manor behind her, realizing that the walls of Pinecrest Hall were only as strong as the integrity of the people who lived within them, and that the true crown she carried was the trust of the families who looked to the mountain for protection. She understood now that the desperation which had once felt like a cage was actually the catalyst that had forced her to discover her own capacity to endure and to lead a gift that poverty had given her in exchange for the comforts it had taken away. She felt a deep, quiet gratitude for every difficult mile of the journey, for the rain that had driven her to the chapel and the storms that had forced them to speak without the armor of their titles. The future was an open horizon filled with the promise of seasons changing and the steady work of building a world where fear was no longer the currency of the land. She turned as she heard Damien's step on the gravel, his white hair catching the final red gleam of the setting sun. And as she slipped her arm through his, she knew that whatever winters lay ahead, they would face them with a single heart and a vision that looked past the darkness and into the enduring light. The final reflection of a long journey often comes in the quietest moment of the evening, when the work of the day is finished, and the mind is allowed to simply rest in the space it has created. Sitting by the fire in the small room of the West Wing, Maeve held an old leather ledger in her lap, her fingers tracing the clean, balanced lines of the latest entries that showed the true recovery of the estate's holdings. She looked across the hearth at Damien, who was reading a book of history his father had left behind. His pale features relaxed in the warm glow of the flames, the snow-white hair falling softly across his shoulder. She realized that the most profound transformations are often the ones that make the least noise, the quiet settling of a spirit that has found its proper alignment after years of wandering through the cold spaces of isolation and doubt. They had built something that would endure long after the current generation had passed into the history of the valley, a legacy of justice and mutual respect that would serve as a blueprint for those who came after them to inherit. She closed the ledger and set it on the table beside her, letting her eyes rest on the fire as the final logs turned to a beautiful bright gold that filled the room with a deep and comforting warmth. The story they had started in the rain was no longer a tale of debt and rescue, but a living truth that breathed in every corner of the ancient house and every cleared acre of the mountain valley. She reached out and took her husband's hand, her fingers finding the strength that had never failed her since the dawn they had signed their names together in the cold stone chapel. And as the midnight bells began to ring softly through the quiet halls of Pinecrest Hall, she closed eyes and welcomed the peaceful dark of a future they had completely won.